of the chapter that I wrote. I don't tend to like to read presentations, although I do it on occasion, depending on my level of comfort with the topic. However, this is a topic that I probably could stand up and talk about for quite some time. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Okay, great. So here's the synopsis, and then we'll see how it unfolds from there. Control and colonization in the name of culture has led to a loss of soul and a disconnection from both inner and outer nature. Although the root of cultivate, the word, means to tend, honor, or cherish, our tendency to tame, control, and avail ourselves of the natural other takes us further from the wild potentiality of nature and human nature than ever before. Our pathological estrangement from wilderness has led to increasing objectification, colonization, and violence. Further, humankind's history with honeybees is a story representative of the Western inclination toward objectification, domination, and enslavement of nature, animals, and even our fellow human beings. A story that may well end in crisis and an ultimate colony collapse of our own. So my chapter in the book is called Between Honey and Pain, Colony Collapse Disorder and the Colonization of the Wild. And I'd like to start off just by sharing with you a little bit my process of how I came to this topic and how this chapter came to be. I was actually taking a class from Craig at Sonoma State University, where I was doing my master's in depth psychology at the time. And he gave us an assignment to pick some kind of a contemporary event or happening, phenomenon, and then to interpret that in a depth psychological way. And I kind of did my usual stewing over what's it going to be. I have no idea. I don't know where to start. And it just happened that right around that time, I heard the news. This was in early 2007. I heard the news that the honeybees had started disappearing, just vanishing by the billions. And it was the most bizarre phenomenon. And something about that just grabbed me, and it wouldn't let go. I mean, I don't know if I can say it struck fear in me, but there was probably something of that. There was something that was just so uncanny about it, meaning not fitting, not at home, that it really just pushed a button in me. And it was almost as if the unconscious just kind of reached out and grabbed me and pulled me right into the hive, and there I was. So I started writing that particular paper on the honeybees, and I remember I just sat there in my backyard, actually, on very nice spring days, with a long extension cord stretched back to where I was sitting, and I wrote that paper for 3 days straight, and I just was in it for 3 days, and the bees were buzzing around me, and there were all the signs of spring and the flowers, and it was a very, it just really immersed me. And as soon as I started looking at the topic, I started noticing bees everywhere, and things started happening to me in tremendous synchronicities that were really impossible to deny. And I started to see them dying everywhere, and they would come and just land on me and kind of walk around on me, and everywhere I looked I would see them just on the ground, just flopping around or already dead. And I started to collect these dead bees, and I didn't know what to do with them. It became something that I really just was so overcome by, that I really began to develop a relationship with the bees themselves and the bees as an archetype. And so that moved into ultimately me writing my master's thesis on the phenomenon of colony collapse disorder and the symbolic look at the nature of the honeybees. And so for those of you who don't know too much about the phenomenon, I'll just recap a little bit, and that is that at the end of 2006, beekeepers began showing up at their hives that they were routinely checking, and as they took the lid off of those box hives, they were discovering that the hives were completely empty, except for the queen and the unhatched brood, and all the honey was there left untouched. And it was just absolutely unbelievable, because the queen is the lifeblood of the hive. She's the one who's laying all of the eggs, and they would never abandon her, because the worker bees, who are 98% or 99% female, the worker bees are female, but 98% of the hive, they take care of the queen, and they groom her, and they feed her, and they make sure that she can go about her work of laying eggs. and they also take care of the brood. And if there isn't new brood hatching all the time, the hive will collapse because there's nobody to do the work, and there's nobody to go out and get the nectar and the honey to make honey and come back. And so it was a very bizarre phenomenon. And even more than that, it wasn't just that they were dying, because bees have been in a state of decline on and off for a good 50 years or so. But the difference was that the bees were actually gone. So normally when bees are around the hive, they start to either wear out their wings or die of old age after about usually 6 to 8 weeks in the summertime when they're busy. They'll just go right outside the hive and they'll die there because they don't want their sister bees to have to clean out their remains, and yet they don't want to be that far from the hive. And so you'll usually see them, and if they have mites or some kind of a parasite or some kind of disease, then that's natural happening. But in this case, they're just gone, vanished. So if you start to engage your imagination around that and wonder what it is that is going on with the bees, I mean, clearly we know that they're probably just dying so dispersed and far from the hive that they're probably out in the fields, but when the bodies are so scattered, you just don't see them that often. I do remember once walking along the beach in Santa Barbara, and I found a dead bee about every 4 or 5 steps. And I walked all the way down the beach, and I counted like up to 200, and then I just stopped. It was a very difficult experience for me. So that's a mystery, and we don't really know what that's about. But there's a very interesting legend as I started digging into this that goes back to Egyptian times, and it's the story of the goddess Neith, spelled N-E-I-T-H. And Neith, the story is that she emerged from the primordial water. So when there was only water, she came out and she created the sun, and then she flew away in the form of a bee. And she ended up going into Lower Egypt and establishing a temple there, and therefore her temple has the sign of the bee, and the words and the hieroglyphs call it the sign of the bee. And the bee has actually always been a part of the insignia of the emperors. Her temple's called the House of the Bee, and then the emperors have a hat that looks like a bee, and when you start digging into it, there's a long history there. And of course, bees have been in Egypt for as long as humans really know about. Humans, we know how long they've been around. It looks like bees have been around for about 100 million years. So they've been around for a lot longer than we have. And so the bee is really associated with creativity, the creative power, the creative forces that came out of this primordial water and made the sun, and then therefore everything that followed that. And it's really appropriate that a bee would be associated with creativity. And John Milton, he was talking about wildness and wild creativity, and he called wilderness, he called it a wilderness of sweets because of the beauty and the creative potential and the raw, wild power of nature. And so it's very appropriate that the two go together. But then, of course, you start looking at human history, and there was a point somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago when humans started picking up sharp sticks and digging in the ground and realizing that they could plant seeds, and that they could replant the same seeds over and over, and that they could grow their own food. And so then they began settling into those areas, and then they needed, villages, and then they had fields, and so they needed fences to make sure that the fields were protected, and then they needed guards to guard the fields so other people wouldn't come in and steal their food, and then they had more population because they were staying in one place instead of traveling all the time, and so you begin to see the beginnings of a culture that is not the same as before. And as that began to happen, you start to see the emergence of what is known as the other with a capital O. And this is a very Jungian archetypal concept, this idea that something that is not me is other. And as we began to have other, we also began to distrust that, because if it's not me, then it's something else, and what does that mean to me? And we started to have this division between us and the other. And we saw that leading to challenges that were we ended up scapegoating people, and we started pointing fingers at people and saying, well, you did this, and you're different than me, and so it must be your fault. And so that began a series of events in human history that have in some ways led us to where we are now, and a lot of it is based on our fear of the other. And so the word cultivate, which is related to the word culture. The word cultivate in its root form means to tend or to cherish something. And so initially that was the case, but of course this has changed over time and become something else, where when we cultivate something now, as a general rule, we tend to try to control it because we are fearful of that other, and we build those fences, and we begin to manipulate nature, and we start using technology, and that leads us down a path that's very it's a slippery slope. We can't imagine our culture without being able to control and manipulate nature and to create technology, and it had to happen on some level because it's a part of the natural growth of the human race. And yet, when you start looking at where we have landed, it becomes a very interesting study, and I think that's probably where I'm going next, but more about that later. So anyway, when you start looking, what's interesting is that bees live in colonies. And of course, the word colony is interesting because when Europeans came over from the other world and landed in the New World, they established colonies. And these colonies were difficult because they were in conflict with the inhabitants that were already here on the land. And of course, it required a certain amount of control of both the natives who lived in this place as well as nature. And that also snowballed into something that became what it is today. In the same way, we have been harvesting honey from honeybees for a long, long time. There is rock art in Africa, which goes back as far as almost 30,000 years ago, that show the humans collecting honey. It shows pictures of them climbing up these tall trees and grabbing the honey from the cliff sides. And so we know that we've been also in relationship with honeybees for quite some time. But of course that has also developed like everything else. And what we know now is that beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, are putting their honeybees through a lot of things that are quite unnatural and very difficult for the bees to deal with. In fact, California has the largest almond crop in the world. And currently, in order for those almonds to be pollinated and to deliver a crop, which, I mean, I enjoy almonds as much as the next person, but this might make you think the next time you have something with almonds in it. Right now, currently, up to 80% of the commercial bees in the United States are brought into Central California, into the Central Valley, in order to pollinate the almond trees that are there. And when you see from the sky, there's just acre on acre on acre on acre on acre of almond trees. And what's happening is mostly the bees are being put on trucks and being shipped across the country, sometimes as far as from Florida or even the Northeast. And they're put in trucks and they're loaded up on these pallets, and they're in the exhaust and the fumes, sometimes in hot weather. And even beekeepers say that they expect to lose about 10% of their bees on the trek across the United States into the Central Valley. And of course, once they're all there, then you start looking at all the issues around. They're all there together. So if there are diseases or mites or parasites or anything, it's spread, and then they all scatter at the end of the season, and then that's spread everywhere. And they have very little concern for the bees, because what they have to do is trick them into actually thinking that it's spring earlier than they would naturally have done that. And so they start feeding them corn syrup so that they can start ramping up the numbers of the hive, so there will be enough bees in the hive to then go out and do the pollination. And so they feed them things like corn syrup, and which is very unhealthy and not at all the usual nectar and pollen that they're used to gathering. And so you start looking at this and you start seeing that as much as the Europeans came over and I hate to generalize, but my ancestors are European, and so I want to take my own responsibility in that, and also to, and at the same time, on the other hand, to hold that tension and honor those in our history who have been much more aware of nature and how we treat it. But the truth is a lot of the Europeans really did not have a lot of regard for the land. It's not the way that they were raised or trained. It was not their culture. And so you see events happening around the colonies where, as the Europeans began to spread out and multiply and grow and take more and more land, they were actually forcing the Native Americans off their land and forced them to march to new territories and new locations where they were not necessarily welcomed. And this led to an event that many of you know of, which is called the Trail of Tears, and it's where the Cherokees, as well as several other tribes, were were on a forced march for up to 500 miles, often in the dead of winter, and at least 25% of the people that were forced onto that march to a new location, which there were already people there who didn't really welcome new people either, but at least 25% of those people perished just from starvation, cold, illness, and that kind of thing. And so when you start looking at the bees being shipped across the country, forced into this sort of a situation, you start to see some parallels and some eerie sort of similarities between, collapse of certain native tribes and collapse of the bees and collapse of other things that are going on around us. And you also start to see a really difficult, I guess, similarity between the fact that before we had sugar, the only source of sweetness was honey. There was really no other place to get anything sweet, and so that's why it's been so valued for thousands of years by humans, because it was sweet. But in this case, as soon as they discovered sugar and discovered that sugar would grow in the New World, particularly in places like Jamaica and the Caribbean, then the Europeans again immediately sort of used up the local population as slaves to grow the sugar and to harvest the sugar from the sugar plantations. And then, of course, once that population was essentially eradicated through that cruel and difficult lifestyle, then they began to import slaves from Africa on the ships. And the slaves were put into these ships and, shackled in the bottom of the ship, essentially, and forced across to a new location where they had not wanted to go in conditions that were very difficult. And so you, again, have this correlation between the way that humans are treating other humans and the way that humans are treating nature. And I see a lot of serious faces out there, and I think, for me, it's really hard because I tend to get really caught up in that too, and I feel myself getting emotional even as I think about it. And I don't know how you guys are affected by that, but it's something that really is distressing to me. At the same time, I think that we have to have hope, because there's so much potential for good in the world. And when you start looking at the colonies themselves of bees and the way that they work together, and the way that every single bee has its place in the hive, and every single one of them has a role that it should play, and every one of them innately knows how to trust their instincts, has that embedded instinct to go out into the world and to get the nectar and the pollen, and then to come back home. And of course, we understand that this is what's probably failing in the case of colony collapse disorder, is that capacity to navigate back home to the hive. And when you start looking at human beings, there was a point in human evolution when we were living in that hive and we always came back to it. So our ego would go out in the world and experience whatever it was that we needed to experience in order to learn, but we were coming back to a community or to nature or to a sense of ourselves or to a sense of the sacred that is bigger than we are. And we were integrating whatever it was that we had collected and gathered and making it honey, essentially, bringing it back to the tribe who could also benefit from that. And so there's a real sweetness about just the way that hives operate and the way that bees are, and this inner knowing of how to manage to come back and return time and time again. And so it's really interesting because the word nectar, which is the main way that bees, the main thing bees need to make honey, is made up of the word nek, N-E-K, which means death, and T-A-R, which means to overcome. So the word nectar means to overcome death. And so when you start thinking in your own life about what it is that you're doing and asking yourself, when is the last time you reintegrated with something sacred, with something that is bigger than yourself? When's the last time that you came home to yourself and you were just aware of what it is that you're doing here on this planet? And I don't mean like a big vision, like a calling or something else, but just presence and being aware of what it is that of what's going on with you and being here in this space. And I think it's a really important lesson, and I'll tell you something, every time you see a bee from now on, I bet that you'll think about that and wonder where it is that they're going, and where is she going, and where has she been, and where is her hive, and is she carrying pollen? And if you stop and start looking at them, you can see the pollen, like they have these bags on their back legs, and they carry the pollen, and some of them are really full, and you can see them. I was looking at my trees this morning, and I have some really great flowering trees in my yard, and I was looking at those trees, and they weren't covered with bees, and they normally should be. It's so cold right now. The bees haven't really come out as much as they normally do, but I just can't stop looking at them. They're just absolutely amazing and remarkable. And, what's interesting is this word hum, which is the sound that we often use to describe the sound that a hive makes or that bees make. It's HUM is related to humus, which means earth, and human. And so when you start looking at the synchronicity and the correlation between the bees and the earth and humans and the way that we can all work together in tremendous synchronicity, it's just really a beautiful thing. So I just want to close by reading you part of a poem, which I don't think I brought. It's back there. That's okay. I'll read you the last paragraph. Poet Mary Oliver, who I dearly love and has some remarkable work. This is the poem. I'll have it back there if you want to read it after, and you can grab me. Poet Mary Oliver describes how the taste of honey is composed of everything lost that is found. In a sonnet, Pablo Neruda reflected evocatively on an ongoing struggle, a journey between honey and pain. By facing ecological anguish and reflecting on it, we begin to address the parts of ourselves that have been left arid, deforested, scattered, and alone. In fully engaging, we discover a song in the silence, the hum of longing to cross-pollinate a reciprocal relationship between bees and bodies, peoples and plants, humans and humus. We find ourselves opening like a flower to the wild. So, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? All right.
The topic that I want to share with you is, my name is Adrian. I'm a PhD student at CRIS, and happy to be here. So what I want to share with you is something that I've called metaxical wisdom, because I believe that that's nature's way